Washington Talk, I'm Eun Jung-cho. China in recent months has been seeking to ease sanctions on North Korea, undermining U.S. maximum pressure on Pyongyang. But after their meeting at the G20, President Trump says President Xi had agreed to work with him 100% on North Korea. How much cooperation can we expect from China?
Something that will be good for China and good for the United States.
In the studio with me today, Ms. Bonnie Glaser, Senior Asia Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ms. Glaser served as a consultant for the U.S. State Department and the Defense Department. Also joining me today, Professor Andrew Yaw at the Catholic University of America. Professor Yaw is also the Director of the Asian Studies programs there. Welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the U.S. and China at the G20 summit came to a truce in the trade war, and President Trump said that Chinese president will cooperate 100%. So what are President Trump's expectations?
President Trump expects Xi Jinping to really abide by the UN Security Council sanctions. President Trump thinks that maximum pressure is still a very important part of U.S. policy. And there have been some signs that China has been easing off a little bit on the sanctions. So I don't think that Korea was really a very central part of the discussion in Buenos Aires, but President Trump just sort of wanted to check in and say, remember, you're still doing maximum pressure. You're still going to stick with the sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to remember that Trump in the past has tried to link these issues. He said that, we'll give China a good trade deal and then we'll get something in return for North Korea. So I think Trump still has that type of expectation. And because he gives this concession to the Chinese, which isn't clear that that will hold or not, but by not raising tariffs by 25%, he may think in his mind that China may give him a little more on the North Korea issue, as Ms. Glaser stated, possibly upholding the sanctions.
Mm-hmm. So that's what President Trump thinks. But what is China's perspectives? Will China cooperate more on North Korea because the trade dispute has come to a truce?
China really sees the North Korea issue as primarily one between the United States and North Korea. China does not believe that its role is really that critical. So I don't think at this point that China is going to do more or less. And whatever China does, it will really serve China's own national interest. The Chinese, I think at this point, are really eager to support what they think is an interest that Kim Jong-un has in pushing forward economic reform. And the Chinese really want to be supportive of that. So the Chinese have been talking with the Russians about the possibility of easing sanctions and providing more support to the North Korean economy and opening up commercial exchanges. And I think that's the direction actually we will be heading. So I don't think North Korea is going to really be an area of really close cooperation between the U.S. and China going forward.
Yeah, because that really goes against the maximum pressure campaign that President Trump is pushing for. And that's exactly where President Trump wants cooperation from China in that area. On the denuclearization front, Andrew, China and U.S. has different priorities and different ideas about how to go forward with denuclearization. So how can China help U.S. on that front? How much will China push North Korea to denuclearize?
Well, China has a different perspective from Washington on denuclearization. As China has declared, they really would like to see some kind of process, a gradual step-by-step process moving forward, whereas Washington wants to put things on the table up front. And I don't know if there's a way for Beijing to try to bridge that gap, but right now it seems like, if anything, Beijing is giving North Korea a bit more leverage rather than trying to meet the gap on the U.S. side. So the best thing China can do is to try to encourage, I think, negotiations to move forward, to get North Koreans to commit to denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. What constructive role can China play on denuclearization?
Well, if we define constructive from the American perspective, then I think that Xi Jinping could encourage Kim Jong-un to take some early steps towards denuclearization to help move the process forward, to accede to some of the demands that the United States has. It's possible that China might encourage North Korea to do more, but at the same time, the Chinese are encouraging the U.S. to do more. Right. They see this as a process that both sides have to take steps forward. The Chinese are worried that if things really get stuck and don't move forward, that they will backslide. And the worst nightmare that I think the Chinese have is that we end up going back to a period where the North Koreans are ratcheting up nuclear tests, missile tests, and President Trump could start talking about fire and fury again, and then the risk of a U.S. attack on North Korea actually would rise.
Right, so China definitely wants denuclearization of North Korea, but at the same time, another priority for China is the stability inside North Korea. So how is that concern playing into this whole denuclearization process?
Well, it's a very important question, and China has always had a hierarchy of interests on the Korean Peninsula. One is to avoid war, second two is avoid instability, and then the third is denuclearization. So the Chinese are willing to pursue denuclearization under conditions that it doesn't create instability in North Korea. This is one of the reasons why the Chinese have been resistant to cut off or reduce the oil that they send to North Korea through the pipeline, because they are worried that if they were to take that kind of dramatic measure, that could cause instability in North Korea.
Mm-hmm. So there are conflicting reports about China's sanctions implementations, that China may be cheating on UN sanctions. What is your take?
There's clear evidence that there are illegal ship-to-ship transfers of oil taking place, I believe both in the East China Sea and the Sea of Japan. There's actually a coalition of countries, including South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States, that's monitoring these. So they're taking photographs of hull numbers, and we know that there are many of Chinese ships involved. I would posit, however, that this activity is not something that is necessarily going on because of the central government's support for it, but maybe they close one eye and they allow it to happen. So there are local actors, actually some from Taiwan as well, who see the opportunity to make a lot of money in circumventing the sanctions.
Professor Yeo, North Korea's Foreign Minister Lee Yong-ho visited Beijing and met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Mm-hmm. And President Xi said he supports the inter-Korean reconciliation and also the peace process between U.S. and North Korea. So why do you think President Xi met with Foreign Minister Ri himself and delivered this message? Well,
as we've been talking about before, I think it's to get the North Koreans to continue negotiations. It's to show their support for denuclearization. It's a reminder that this is a process that's going to take some time, and so I think China does have an interest in denuclearization. I think Bonnie's absolutely correct that instability is a higher priority, but to the extent that denuclearization can bring instability, I think they would like to see this process move forward. And I suspect that there was also some discussion about what took place at the G20 summit in Argentina. Xi's meeting with Trump. I think some of that information may have been relayed to the North Korean foreign minister as well.
Mm-hmm. And the North Korean foreign minister also met with Chinese foreign minister Wang Yi and other higher-level officials. So what do you think would be some of the closed-door messages that Beijing wants to give to Pyongyang at this time?
Wang Yi's message would have been to encourage the continued improvement in inter-Korean relations and to encourage North Korea to try and move towards having another summit with President Trump. But I think also the Chinese might have been talking a little bit about an upcoming meeting by Xi Jinping to Pyongyang next year. And that visit had been talked about for 2018. Now it looks like it's going to be 2019. So I wouldn't be surprised if the two sides are beginning to talk about when that visit might take place.
So President Xi met with Kim Jong-un 3 times already. So do you think the bilateral relationship has been restored to the lip and teeth level?
China-North Korea relations has not been as close as lips and teeth for a very long time, if it really ever was. But yes, that phrase used to be used, and it no longer is. I think that China's influence over North Korea, its communication channels into the party and the security services really atrophied over a period of time. And Xi Jinping had not met with the leader. And once Xi Jinping saw that the inter-Korean relationship was improving, the U.S. was going to have a summit, he moved very quickly to meet with Kim Jong-un to try and begin to restore the relationship, or at least to improve it to the extent that China would have some leverage and be able to influence the course of events going forward. That said, I think that North Korea remains very suspicious of Chinese intentions and does not want to be the sort of junior partner, which is the way China sees North Korea. So I think that there's a lot of friction between those two countries.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and if I can add to just what Bonnie said, I mean, China has some leverage over North Korea because of the economic ties, but politically, as we've seen, North Korea is going to do what it wants to do. And so there's only so much that China can really do. And I think that grates China, it sometimes rubs China the wrong way. And, right, so in terms of the influence that China has over North Korea, it's somewhat limited. But we are seeing movement again in North Korea-Chinese relations. As you mentioned, 3 visits by Xi Jinping with Kim Jong-un. So I think things are moving forward again, but to say that they're close friends or allies again, I think we're still not quite there yet.
Mm-hmm. So the rivalry between U.S. and China is intensifying. So how is this affecting the two Koreas?
There's been a real ratcheting up of tensions between the United States and China, especially since President Trump came to power. And in 2017, there was more cooperation on North Korea, and the trade issues were put on the shelf. But as that has changed and the trade issues have come to the fore and tariffs have been levied by both sides, a lot of countries in the world, including, I think, the Koreas, are worried about being sort of caught in the middle, being maybe forced to choose between Washington and Beijing. Every country in the world, particularly in the region around China, but really every country in the world wants to have good relations with both the United States and China. And many of China's neighbors want to benefit from China's economic largesse. South Korea has a very good economic relationship, of course, with China. And so the room for smaller countries to maneuver has been squeezed by this competition between the United States and China.
There's a saying that Koreans have where they describe Korea as being a shrimp among whales, and it's a reference to their geostrategic vulnerability, that they're often caught between the conflict, the competition among great powers. And that's always been a concern for both Koreas. But I think as we see U.S.-China tensions ratcheting up, I think that fear is there again, that there's a broader geostrategic competition between two major powers, and somehow the two Koreas have to navigate between that. I think the problem is especially acute for South Korea because they have ties to both China and the United States. North Korea doesn't have diplomatic relations with the U.S., so that's fine. But really for South Korea, sometimes they're put in this position where, do we have to choose between China, between the U.S.? We've seen China punishing South Korea before for decisions that are made, for instance, the deployment of a missile defense system, THAAD, on Korean territory. They've been punished by the Chinese. The U.S. Likes to remind South Korea as well, what the priorities are for denuclearization. So somehow South Korea has to navigate that. And so when tensions arise, that makes it much more difficult for South Korea to make strategic choices that they would like to make on their own terms.
Professor Yao, President Trump at the G20 said, confirmed that U.S.-North Korea second summit will be held in either January or February. So what are your thoughts about the second summit being held so soon at a time when we don't have high-level talks or working-level talks?
Right. So first I should put out a disclaimer that it's a big if at the moment. I know that Bolton and National Security Advisor Bolton had stated that there would be a summit coming soon, but at the 11th hour, things can always change. That being said, I'm more on the skeptical side this time. I think the last time you had me on the program, I had more positive reactions to the Singapore summit, but we've already had the big pageantry. We don't need to have that again, but there has to be some substance, and we don't really see that. We don't see North Korea moving forward in terms of denuclearization, and unless we see something concrete, I don't see why there needs to be a second summit so soon. So we have to wait and see. I think we need to wait a little bit longer. It's a little bit premature, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. We'll wait and see what happens, and we'll leave it here and watch video for our next discussion.
공식 친선 방문 왔습니다.
Foreign Minister Lee Yong-ho's latest trip included visits to Hanoi and Beijing. Vietnam and China embraced market reforms under the control of a single-party communist state. Now, Secretary Pompeo in July told North Korea to emulate Vietnam's economic reforms. So what do you think could be some of the key takeaways from Vietnamese model for North Korea?
Right, and Kim Jong-un had also stated before that Vietnam might be a model for their economy to follow. So the Doi Moi plans that the Vietnamese implemented in 1986, it's basically marketization with socialist characteristics. And the idea is that North Korea too can marketize, that it can reform its economy without necessarily making radical political changes. So the idea is that you can have economic development, you can improve your country's economy without changing the leadership. And I think that's something that Kim Jong-un will be looking towards.
And also the communist Vietnam took over the liberal Vietnam and unified. So would this also be something Kim Jong-un would be looking for? Is this even remotely possible on the Korean Peninsula, do you think?
Right. So I don't think it's a very good parallel between North and South Vietnam, just because of the disparate between the two countries. I mean, North Korea is in a much different place from, I think, where North Vietnam as well. And I don't think Kim Jong-un can realistically think about taking over South Korea at this point, given the disparity in the size of the economies. So probably not a good analogy. What he will be concerned about, though, is when you take on these reforms, it requires investment. It requires an opening of information. And so there is this risk that if he takes on these market reforms, that it could destabilize the regime, because as more information comes into the country, it means people will actually see what they've been told hasn't been correct, that, to be frank, that they've been told a bunch of lies. And so there's always this fear that with marketization, it means more information coming into the country, more outside influence. And does that mean Kim Jong-un has to cede control to someone else? So that's always a concern up at the top.
Mm-hmm. Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping in the 70s also initiated economic reforms and opening up. So what could be some of the lessons for North Korea from the Chinese model?
I think Andrew's right that opening up and reform is of limited interest to North Korea because of the risks to their regime. China was never concerned that the Chinese people would suddenly learn that the outside world was so much more developed than China. There was a lot of information flow. In fact, China was more open in the late 1970s and 1980s than it is today, with the advent of the internet and the ability of Chinese leaders to control information coming in. There isn't a lot of information on certain areas that the Chinese are fearful of. And I think the areas that North Korea might be fearful of would be even greater. So there's interest in economic development, but keeping a tight lid on political control, any political dissent or protests. The Chinese model may be to some extent appealing, but North Korea, I think, wants to, in fact, move away from its close economic dependence on China. And any imitation or adoption of that Chinese model would probably bring with it closer ties to China. I think actually North Korea really wants to develop more ties with other countries, to diversify, have more options, certainly beginning with South Korea, but also potentially with Japan, maybe more relations with Russia and with the United States. And so this, it's a mixed bag for North Korea. China is North Korea's first choice.
Mm-hmm. Just briefly, we talked about China's concerns on North Korea's instability. So considering the possibility of an instability in North Korea, how does China view North Korea's possible opening up and market reforms?
Well, the Chinese believe that by opening up and bringing about economic reform, that North Korea will become more stable, more viable long-term as a separate state, which is China's preference. I don't think China, under all circumstances, would oppose reunification, but its preference is to keep North Korea as a separate state. For years, under prior Chinese leaders, the Chinese would take Kim Jong-il to their special economic zones to demonstrate the great achievements that China has made. So they've long wanted North Korea to implement economic reforms, and they're quite concerned that if there is a real famine again in North Korea, that this could really trigger instability in the country.
Mm-hmm. Professor Yaw, so whether it be Chinese model, whether it be Vietnamese model, what do you think will be the scale that North Korea will adopt? Would it be modest or full-fledged?
I mean, it has to be gradual, of course. I think if they just open up to foreign investors and and with foreign investment, it means changes in laws. You have to have transparency. If I'm an American investor, do I want to invest in North Korea if I don't know what's going to happen to my money? You need things like property rights. So if for North Korea to make these changes, I think to do it all at once, I mean, that would be, I think that would really be the demise of the North Korean regime, to be honest. So if anything happens, it's going to be gradual. But what we actually have seen is a very stop-and-go process. There are markets right now in North Korea. They have been growing, but at times we've seen the North Korean regime clamp down or kind of put the squeeze back on to put a control, put a lid on the markets. And I think that's because they are concerned about instability, and they've never tried this process before. So if anything, it'll be gradual, but in a stop-and-go type process.
We'll leave it here and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today's picture shows the Miss Universe Singapore showing what she will wear at the Miss Universe Parade of National Costumes. Her national costume consists of white dove wings, symbolizing peace, and a blue skirt with a print of a handshake between leaders of U.S. and North Korea. Singapore was the venue of the first U.S.-North Korea summit. This picture is taken by Singapore's The New Paper. Andrew, what's your reaction?
Sure. Well, if I were a judge in terms of aesthetics, I'm not sure if I could give high scores for the dress itself, but in terms of highlighting Singapore's important role in diplomacy, I think she should get bonus points for, at least from her foreign ministry, for putting on a dress like this.
Ms. Glaser?
Well, I think it definitely is a signal that North Korea would like to have improved relations with the United States. I don't know, maybe the wings mean they are about to fly into some positive future, but yeah, aesthetically, I don't know. I wouldn't give her high marks either.
Sorry, Miss Singapore.
Me neither. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Ms. Glaser, Professor Yeo, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.